Hi there, everybody. You are listening to the Alchemi-culture podcast. I'm your host, Phoenix Aurelius, and tonight it's just me and you. In fact, tonight I wanted to talk a little bit more about IDF technology because that's one of the things that most of the people who are familiar with my work really are unable to get behind because they lack a complete frame of reference for what IDF is. They think that it's some sort of newfangled technology or that it's some sort of hokey science or something like that. I just figured I'd sit down and break it down and share with you my perspective, my experience, and the actual history of the technology that we call IDF today and how it's actually been around for centuries and centuries. So let's go ahead and just hop right in. First of all, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term IDF, that just stands for Intrinsic Data Fields. And there are a lot of different names actually for the same type of technology. If we go back into the distant past, we could call it magic. We could call it intention setting. We could call it prayer work. We could call it any form of effective mentalism. We could call it, in more modern terms, quantum scalar technology. We could call it even radionics technology or psionics technology or psychotronics technology. All of these are terms that really are talking about the exact same thing. In fact, even Rupert Sheldrake's work back in the 80s with morphic fields or morphogenetic fields, morphogenetic identity, all of this is all encompassing an intrinsic data field. So let's go ahead and talk about what an intrinsic data field is. First of all, it is a holographic and fractal concept, which means that no matter how macrocosmic or microcosmic you get in your subjective investigation of any particular item, everything is composed of intrinsic data fields. So if you take a look at the human organism as a whole, for instance, you might see one intrinsic data field of that entire human organism. But then if we wanted to say to take a look at the liver or the spleen, then each one of those organs or systems of the body or any level that you want to look at has its own intrinsic data field. And if we say we're zooming in on the liver, now we break open the liver in terms of looking at various hepatic cells, bile production, all of these things, the bile itself, the cells that are contributing to that, various forms of tissue, various areas or lobes inside of the liver. Now what we're looking at is that each one of those also has its own intrinsic data field. So, and then you could keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Okay, so there's the mitochondria of that liver cell, for instance, has its own intrinsic data field. You can keep going down far beyond the subatomic level, and that's just the material level. Okay, we can also take a look into any of the energetic patterns because those also have an intrinsic data field. So it is a completely holographic and fractal technology, or holographic and fractal principle. And in fact, it really is, as we would refer to it, completely quantum in its approach to how we might look at something. Now, many of you are probably thinking at this point, okay, well, that's all very good and grand, but how does this really work? Well, let me just break it down for those of you who are already familiar with energy work. Those of you who have practiced, say, Reiki or Theta or hypnosis or many other different types of interfacing practices that are able to influence wellness, you already know that energy is able to influence matter and that matter also influences energy. What sometimes is not really well known, especially inside of the energy work kind of paradigm, is how to very specifically alter something in ways that is completely quantifiable. Certain bioresonance machines and biofeedback machines and things like this claim to be able to make these kinds of influences on subtle energy bodies, and thereby are able to influence in some way the physiological constituents that correspond to those energetic principles. People who are doing Reiki oftentimes use symbols that are drawn and held visually as energetic archetypes or codices that are able to then be transmitted through the various layers of the energetic body and penetrate and therefore have some sort of effect on the physiological bodies. But doing that just through, say, Reiki or through, nondescript energy work, it tends to be very subjective based on the practitioner, and it can be very hard to dial in. When we're using modern radionics equipment or modern psionics or psychotronics equipment, we typically have what are called radionic rates, which come in a variety of different ways that are able to identify a numerical, primarily numerical, some of them are alphanumerical, um, code that corresponds to the particular area or item that we are trying to influence. So if we are trying to influence the entire physical vitality, that physical vitality has a particular radionic rate. And there you can create radionic rates as well. They're by no means set or limited. There's, entire books of various radionic rates depending on the types of equipment that you're using. For instance, most radionics or psionics or psychotronics equipment have a bunch of different dials, and these dials are numerical calibrators. Some of them go from 0 to 100. In fact, many of them do. And you dial numbers while operating a stick pad. And a stick pad, which we'll talk more about here in just a few minutes, basically is a way of performing a kinesiological response system to being able to address or to find out what the problem is with something. It is not so different from divinatory methods from the past. And in fact, the Bushmen of Africa did use an actual stick pad, which originated and took the shape of a highly polished wooden block. And this was just a block polished with a bunch of sand so that it was a very smooth surface on the top. And traditionally, shaman from various areas of Africa would rub this block while having a sick individual in their presence or in their healing tent or whatever, and have a number of different remedies that they are also holding under the block. So there might be, say, herb A sitting underneath the block in the shaman's hand. The shaman sets the intention. Is this the correct herb to use? Rubs the block. If his fingers continue to move without experiencing any friction or sticking, therefore we call it a stick. If they don't stick, then that means no. If they do stick, then that means yes. And basically, this is just, causal programming. It's very, very archetypal binary coding. A 0 would basically be an open circuit, and a stick would be a closed circuit. Okay, so you have your zeros and your ones. It's a very, very manual, very analog way of doing this. Pendulums are essentially able to do very much the same thing. It's a type of kinesiological response that is, inside of the realm of what is considered to be divination today. But those who know how to use it extremely well are able to produce a tremendous amount of answers for things. It does take practice and it does take calibration, just like any art, any skill, any science, in order to understand how to use it very well. But the basic principle is available and open to anybody and everybody who tries it. It's just that some people may, by nature, have a little bit more of a skill inherently or a talent for doing it, and others may have to work, relatively hard at being able to use different divinatory methods, be they tarot or, Ogham or various staves, runes. Anything that is really a divinatory method is able to interact with the quantum field via the human consciousness. And these stick pads are absolutely the same. So Realistically, the operator is using a set of dials or a single dial in some instances and a stick pad, and they will type in, or sometimes manually, especially on older equipment, they will write down a particular intention, like, let's say uh, gastric chief cells. Okay, those are cells inside of the stomach. Let's just take those for example. And then they will operate a dial or a series of dials and operate the stick pad simultaneously. And let's say that there are two dials, okay? So they operate the dial from 0, moving on their way up to 100, and they're rubbing the stick pad. And when the dial that they're operating gets to a, say, level 10, then, and their finger sticks on the stick pad, then what that indicates is that the first number that corresponds to that gastric cell would therefore be a 10. And then if they have two dials, then it's a US2 tuning rate, or maybe a UK2 tuning rate. And so there's a dash in between that and the next number. They would move on to the next dial while keeping that first dial at a 10. And then they would do the same thing. They would rub their fingers on the stick pad and take a measurement using the second dial. And let's just say that it stops at 43. Okay, their right hand that is operating the stick pad sticks to the stick pad at number 43. And so therefore the tuning rate that they would use for gastric chief cells would be 10-43. Now, realistically, I have played around with this quite a bit, and I don't think that radionics rates make nearly as much of a difference or an impact, at least in the context of using the equipment that I use with the SE5 2000, as what the actual intention is, because I feel that the work that is being done and the frequencies that are being sent are largely just an extension of the intention of the operator. And as many of us know, if you've ever read what's it called? Oh, geez, I'm pulling a blank. It's something like the quantum universe. There's also the body electric, especially anybody who's ever read the book by Dr. Richard Gerber, Vibrational Medicine, then you begin to understand that there are actual scientific connections that bridge consciousness, especially intention, and matter. And these are subtle currents of energy. Now, historically, these subtle currents of energy, realistically, are broken down, for thousands of years into various archetypal ways. And in the Kabbalah, as it's, basically passed on from the Hebrew people down through, even into the Mohammedan or Arab territories, and then made its way into Europe, and practiced as Christian Kabbalah, Cabala, which is different than Qabala, which is different than Qabbala, which is different than Kabbalah. All of these indicate different types of Kabbalistic practice that share a same root or the same thread. But basically, these Kabbalistic philosophies all maintain that there are four worlds that all exist simultaneously, that overlap one over the other, and that are composing a multi-dimensional reality. The first of these is going to be the spiritual dimension, which we call Atzilut. And then we have what some people call the mental dimension. Other people, like myself, would call this the causal dimension. This is called Baraya. And then we have the realm of formation that is basically what most people today would refer to as the astral realm. And this would be Yetzirah, it means formation. And then finally, we have the physical realm of Asaya, which is the physical or physiological realm. And these, of course, once we hit the point of Aristotelian elements, start to, as they're integrated into Hellenic philosophy through Hellenic Jews or Hebrews that were Hellenized, what we end up getting are elemental associations that have become actually quite key to the practices of alchemy. And so we see that Atzilut corresponds to the element of fire. And we see that Baraya corresponds to the element of wind. And we see that Yetzira is the element of water, and that Asaya corresponds to the element of earth. Okay, so we've already seen that. Now we fast forward many thousands of years, and we start to get new scientific data that is starting to look at multi-dimensional universes within the context of quantum physics. And the best that we can see right now, there are physical dimensions to life. Okay, there's spatial dimensions. We see those. We also see dimensions of time. But then we can also talk about the human multidimensional experience. And by that, what I really mean is that, of course, we have a physiological body. You can see that. We can interact with that. We can touch a table. We can touch a spoon. We can eat food. We can do all of these things. There is obviously a physiological correspondence and interaction that is able to be had in the human experience. But at that same time, we also have emotional experiences. So if I say, go ahead and hand me a handful of your sadness, for instance, or of your particular emotional longing for a place that you've never been to that you want to go to. Okay, these are particular human emotions that are actually very common within the human experience. They're felt by everybody. And we can't dissect those out of the human body. We don't know how to provide a handful of that, but they still interact with us all the time. And they actually far transcend just, our baser physiological response of neurotransmitters and hormones. And they're also much greater than what can be accounted for just by neurons and neuronal and nervous signals, and even endocrine signals. Okay. So the experience of our emotions, we have to say, is part of our multidimensional composition. Same thing with thoughts and images and memories. These things all exist in what we might refer to as a mental plane or a mental dimension. And traditionally within Paracelsian and psychic work, we would refer to thoughts and emotions existing within the astral plane, specifically within the lower aspect of the astral plane. And this is what Paracelsus referred to as the archeus, which was basically a halfway point between the astral and the physical. Various other cosmologies might refer to that as the etheric plane or the etheric interface. It's just a halfway point. It is neither one nor the other. It is the blurred space between both. It's like when you take a look out on the ocean, where does the ocean actually stop? And where does the, horizon really begin? Where does the air that is sitting on top of the ocean really begin? There is a blurred area there. And the same thing is true with what we might see in terms of the astral body and the physiological bodies. And in fact, those, I guarantee every single person, I used to teach a lot of psychic development courses, and every single person can actually see a field. It's traditionally known as a blue corona, but it is a field of somewhat fuzzy energetic discharge that is able to be sensed and or physiologically seen, hovering just an inch to about 4 or 5 inches, depending on the vitality of the individual being observed around the actual figure of the human body. Okay, and if you just let your eyes actually go at rest, you change from a point of attention to awareness. You become aware of a thing instead of paying attention to a thing, and you will begin to see this very clear coronal discharge. This is basically what is referred to as the blue corona, and that is considered to be part of the etheric body or an emanation of the astral body. And then out beyond that, then you would see more of these astral things, which when we talk about astral, we're talking about star stuff. And it's long been considered that the human body is a microcosm of the macrocosm. And so we are composed of all of these different planetary and constellational attributes within inside ourselves. And it's often been considered that Aries, as the constellation that starts, more or less the entire zodiac, it's considered to be the first sign of the zodiac along the ecliptic. That is the head, and then it goes to Taurus, which is the nose and esophagus and throat, and then down to Gemini, which is going to be the arms, and to Cancer, which is the breast and the stomach, and Leo, which is the heart and the spine, and Virgo, which are the intestines and the liver and bile, and to Libra, which are the hips and kidneys as well. We also see that Scorpio basically governs over the sexual and excretory organs. We see that Sagittarius deals over the legs and also parts of the nervous system. We see that Capricorn deals over the knees and also the elbows, that Aquarius deals with the ankles and the wrists and the electrical system of the body. Also, I should make note really quickly that Capricorn also deals with not just knees and elbows, but all of the skin, hair, tissue, nails, things like that, bone, teeth. And then Pisces finally deals with the feet and also with lymphatic system, with the flow of things inside of the body. So the constellations along the ecliptic actually are very important and make their way into the body within various philosophies throughout history. We also see that Ophiuchus today, and this is really my take on Ophiuchus because there is a lot of controversy around this, but through IDF technology and otherwise, I've been able to come to an idea or a proposed philosophy, a theory, if you will, that Ophiuchus actually deals with our DNA. And the reason is that Ophiuchus is seen as the serpent handler, and our DNA literally looks like a caduceus, intertwined serpents. And so it's just an idea. It's a philosophy. We don't have to get caught up with that. But within the ecliptic of these constellations around us, all of the different planets that we know that we can see, especially with the eyes historically, and with very crude equipment, dance within this ecliptic. And as they do that, they are essentially creating various energetic signatures within us. And so each of the planets are corresponding to each of the organs. Like, for instance, Sol, or the sun, deals with the heart. It also deals with the spine. Moon deals with the brain. It also deals with the breasts. It also deals with the stomach. Okay. And we can see, you probably heard in the constellations that, Leo deals with heart and spine. Well, it's because Sol is the governor, so to speak, of Leo, and Luna is the governor, so to speak, of Cancer. And those are the only two that have their own, only two constellations that have their very own constellations that they govern. Those two planets, they govern over just a single constellation, whereas all of the other planets historically have two different constellations that they correspond to. And today, now that we know that there are actually more of what we would consider to be planets within what is considered to be our solar system, so we have Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, etc., we're able to actually extend that out a little bit more and make it so that there are unique constellations for each of the remaining zodiac. So that Uranus has its own connotation, and Pluto its own connotations, and so on and so forth. So we begin to see that there are correspondences, and they kind of correspond and change over time. There's not been one answer that we can land upon that's perennial, and that's largely because nobody has a complete understanding of all of the intrinsic data fields that compose our multidimensional reality. We're constantly in an evolutionary search to try and understand these things. But these various planetary and constellational forces make themselves known by similar correspondences within the body. And this is referred to as the astral body. It's the emanations of not only the zodiac or the constellations along the ecliptic and the planets that dance along with them in our solar system that are made present in the body, but that is largely what we have a long-standing tradition of that has transcended and gone through many, many, many different cultural adaptations since the beginning of time. And so this astral body is definitely part of the multidimensional construction of the human organism and just of reality in general. We have different thoughts, we have different cycles, okay? And when we talk about cycles of humankind, we're largely talking about the various archetypes of where planets are at any given time, because even though algorithmically it's a very complex series of potential variables, all of these variables have played out through history and they're easily calculable so that we can find when was the last time that all of these planets were in the very same place that they are today along the ecliptic, and what were the cycles happening geologically, or if humankind was around during the course of humankind or during the course of animal life. And we can take a look at that archaeologically, we can take a look at that botanically, we can take a look at that from anthropological angle, we can also take a look at that from psychological angles, and just sociological angles as well, by comparing various themes and seeing the archetypal themes and the similarities that are playing out. And it's a one-to-one correspondence. So we can see that entire cycles of humankind on a macrocosmic level from sociological perspectives based on their geolocation on Earth are all operating according to this kind of divine timing. And so, if that's happening on a more macrocosmic level, of course, that has to be happening on a more microcosmic level as well. And those changes are going to be slightly different for each person depending upon their relative position of all of those planets in various constellations and their geolocation at the time of their birth. And that's really the basis of proper medical astrology, or what I call proper, true sidereal medical astrology, which is a field that, as far as I'm aware, I have essentially created because I haven't talked to anybody else who has done it. So, as it usually happens, there are probably other people out there who have done this, who are looking at these types of things, but I just haven't encountered them. And so the thought has not been borrowed by anybody else. That being said, that there's the astral body. The causal body is basically dealing with sacred geometry, or what we would refer to as sacred geometry, which is really nothing other than zeros and ones. It's a type of binary coding whereby angles actually are zeros. They are interruptions to an open circuit that connect one thing to another, and then lines or segments are ones. And so through series of segments and angles, we are able to create myriad diversity of geometries. And these are three-dimensional codices of start and stop signals, just like binary coding is. And even as all of our internet coding and digital programming today is really just sets of more complex series of binary coding through, say, C++ or Java or any other different type of coding systems that exist, Unicode, we are able to put these all together in a way that have various values. So you might take a look at the Platonic solids. Those are like the first six, including the sphere. Okay, there's 5 Platonic solids plus the sphere. So the first 6 types of shapes that really give us something to deal with. And from that, all different myriads of possibilities of geometric expression can really be born through adaptations, manipulations, etc., that can happen based on those first primordial shapes. So those are kind of like the first Unicode creations. And then finally, we have the spiritual dimension. And the spiritual dimension is our source of unity. Where did all of the things that are created come come from? I mean, what's the lowest common denominator between them? Well, I mean, the lowest common denominator between all things that are created is that they are created. So what is that force of creation? welcome to the spiritual. So when we take a look at these first basic building blocks, this is our multidimensional composition. Let's go ahead and take a break. Have you heard about our Spagyrics of the Month Club yet? As you probably know, we release 5 new Spagyrics each month. These range in the style of Spagyric pharmacopoeia from tinctures, elixirs, essences, clyci, stones, and much more. But now, you can get your hands on all 5 new releases each month at just a fraction of the normal cost by being part of our Spagyrics of the Month Club. It's the very best way to inexpensively build your home Spagyric apothecary, and it's also the best way to support our research academy. Participating is easy. Sign up for the $75 a month subscription on our website, and we ship you a 4 ml size of all 5 newly released Spagyrics that month. And shipping's even included for all orders within the USA. The best part is, you just sign up once and sit back and receive your new Spagyrics delivered right to your door. It really doesn't get any easier. To get started or to learn more, go to phoenixaurelius.org and scroll down to the Spagyrics of the Month Club area on our homepage. As always, thanks so much for supporting our work. All right, welcome back from the break. Before we left, we were talking about multidimensionality and how this ties into IDF. So let's go ahead and bridge that gap again. So we've already decided now that we have a physiological body, and we have an astral body, and we have a causal body, and we have a spiritual body. And even if we don't want to refer to it as a body, the human organism interacts with all of these different planes. Okay, anybody who has ever taken drugs and seen the source of all of creation or whatever, okay, whether that be through LSD or magic mushrooms or ayahuasca or even through just deep states of meditation, that's probably how it first originated. Deep states of meditation, dream space, etc. All of these types of experiences connect us to that spiritual source of unity. And that actually is the unity consciousness that so many people in the modern New Age philosophy are hankering after. And then we also have very clear duality. And now this is going to be highly controversial in the social justice warrior era, where I talk about zeros and ones, or feminine and masculine. Negative polarity, positive polarity, all these things, because everybody wants to create multiple different combinations of those. And if you wait until I get to the astral, then you'll see how there are multiple different combinations of those. And I'm not trying to be sexist or impose some sort of patriarchal order of things, or impose upon you the various thoughts that are in some way segregational, based on what I'm talking about here, because realistically, everything at its source really separates into 2 things, and it's the resistance and also the dynamic of interplay between these 2 things, of zeros and ones, of stop and start sequences, of negative polarity and positive polarity, that creates a flow. And we see this specifically in electrical technology. Okay, we're able to see with electromagnetism that where we have a particular pole and we create a resistance between those poles, now we have a flow of electrons, we have a flow, we have current, and that is able to generate energy. But it first has to break out into 2. So unity ultimately ends up breaking into 2 and knowing itself through 2 very diabolically different ways that it's able to primordially express itself. And in this primordial expression, all myriad number of things can be created, which leads us to the next series of density, which we would call the astral. And this is where various combinations of zeros and ones, various combinations of what we could refer to as sacred geometry, or just various geometries, end up interplaying in order to create what we might refer to today as archetypal energy. So just as Saturn presides over, birth and death and cycles of destruction, and Jupiter governs over our jovial nature and our happiness and our emotions in so many different ways, and just as the sun governs over our own vitality and the quality of vitality, and Luna over our caliber of thoughts, and also partially plays with our emotions and deals with the flow of energy and things like this. and also, the tides of energy, specifically with the moon. Every different planet has its own archetypal force that interplays very deeply with not only the Earth. And let me just explain that really quickly, because what we're talking about here is that these various planets end up coming in various relative proximities to our planet at any given time. And as they come closer to the planet, most of them have an electromagnetic field and or a magnetosphere, and that ends up, and if they don't, they still have a gravitational impulse to them. Okay, so we're talking about various scientific forces here that are able to interplay very much so with Earth's own force on a macrocosmic scale. And being a largely dependent individual on the Earth for consistency of electromagnetism, magnetospheric and barometric pressure, and gravitational force, and all of the different forces of strong nuclear, weak nuclear, gravitational, electromagnetic forces, we require some sort of stability in order for our own systems to be stabilized. Okay, and we know that gravity is relative now. It's not the same constant that it has been considered to be for a very long time. We can see that time actually moves faster the higher up that a person is, the further away from the Earth's center. So we're able to see that there are anomalies, and maybe these theories still need to be evolved and reworked. So I'm not trying to, again, shove any sort of cosmology down your throat. But what I'm saying is that from what we can observe and what we do agree upon generally, even if the ideas and the theories aren't perfect at the present moment, is that we are dependent upon a macrocosmic set of energetic principles to be able to create ourselves as a stable physiological unit, or even a stable multidimensional unit. And as there are fluctuations with the Earth's field, especially with, say, the electromagnetic field, as we see in particular with solar flares and solar wind activity, when these types of things happen, we are subject to all sorts of things where our own electromagnetic interfaces, which are primarily electrochemical interfaces, are able to be interrupted or experience various anomalies in the way that they, quote unquote, ideally should and do work. And so, if I shoot you with an electromagnetic pulse, then you're going to have all sorts of different types of things. You may lose parts of your memory. You may not be able to talk so well. You may, have heart attack. You may have, multiple different systems of your body go haywire, primarily with the endocrine system and the nervous system, which are two of the major interfaces of electric energies via electrochemistry. But also the heart and the brain, they each have their own very clear electromagnetic signature, which we can see with sensitive types of electromagnetic spectrum imaging. Heart Math Institute has some really fantastic images and studies along that, where we can see that the brain and the heart each have their own electromagnetic fields. So I think that it goes without saying, realistically, that this dynamic interplay of various planets through the cosmos work on us on very quantitative ways that we can see and measure, and that those have qualitative changes that correspond to them within various, life organisms, especially within the human organism. And then finally, within the physiological bodies as well, we're able to see how those things like electrochemistry, which, if I say, hand me a neuron, that can be a really difficult task to do from a surgical or physiological perspective, but we can still observe it, just like we can observe our thoughts and emotions that might be in some way corresponding to that electrical energy of neurons that are passing through the nervous system and or the rest of the body. So we're able to see that there is definitely a multidimensionality to the human organism. Okay. And I think that this is really important to understand, because within that multidimensionality, intrinsic data fields are able to impact various layers of density and various aspects of each of those densities, that are able to make impacts upon the specified target or the recipient of these intrinsic data field frequencies. So again, lots of ways of being able to do this have existed, for millennia. First of all, you could read the intrinsic data field through soothstones or through runes, through tarot, through pendulum work, through other things, because they are largely unseen forces that are being able to be read through qualitative interpretation, which is, I have to admit, highly subjective. Okay. The consciousness and the perception of the operator of those technologies or those methods of divination are going to largely be the filter through which the information is passed. And the filtrate, which is to say, the information that comes through is only going to be as pure as the channel or the filter, the person who is able to perform. We might call that the diviner, who is able to get this information, whether that's through astrology and reading the stars, whether that's through pendulum work, whether that's through muscle testing and kinesiology. All of these different methods have always existed. It could even happen through psychic perception. Okay. So there have always been ways of being able to read what we are now referring to as intrinsic data fields. That's not a new technology, and neither is the ability to interact or to influence intrinsic data fields, even the more subtle ones, like, for instance, various magical practices, okay, of both healing and cursing. These are ways that you're able to interact with various intrinsic data fields. There are many other different types, like, when you're casting spell work for abundance or for love or for health or for all of the myriad things that exist. These types of things are being able to influence intrinsic data fields. And the same thing is true with prayer. Now, what is absolutely true is the purity of the intention and whether that intention is working with what is likely to happen or able to happen within any particular cycle of energy that exists within the dimension that it is meant to influence. That is really what ultimately determines the success or the outcome of whether that spell or that prayer or that intention is going to come to fruition. And that's a really important principle to understand because, for instance, if you are trying to, cast spells for all of humanity to quickly awaken all of a sudden and to understand all of the secrets of the universe so that we can live very happily and peacefully as harmonious individuals here on this planet, as so many new age individuals are. And I don't say that they should stop doing that. But if they're trying to do that, that whole idea really exists in the astral with the cycles of karma and understanding and wisdom and relation and death and all of the different astral components. Now, if the planets are all in constellations that are very cohesive to that very same intention at the time that the intention is placed out, now there is astral fortitude that is already moving in that direction. And so the intention becomes much more likely to happen. Okay. I think it was best said by one of my favorite colleagues and peers and teachers, John Michael Greer, when he said that the purpose of magic, and I'm more or less paraphrasing, this isn't a direct quote, but it's probably very similar to what he said, is that magic is not a system of trying to browbeat your own will upon the universe and make something happen that is otherwise completely impossible. It's being able to set an intention and cast it into the atmosphere where various cycles of nature, whether they be celestial or terrestrial, or telluric would be another term for that, are able to essentially work with that goal in order to help it to manifest. And so people who are constantly doing things that are not necessarily likely to happen from a statistical or variable perspective, uh, and then get very discouraged that their work is not very potent and therefore magic is quote unquote not real. That is a really wrong state of perspective, and it's not a very scientific way of going about things. You have to understand the multitudinous cycles that might exist within any of the multidimensional components that you're pumping your intention into to see how likely it is, and then to have the discretion to wait until a particular cycle comes upon your experience where your intention will then come to fruition. It's like just going out and casting seeds in the desert. Very few seeds in the desert are actually ever going to come to fruition because it's not the right environment. However, if you go out into a tropical environment and you cast those same seeds, now you're probably going to have more things actually begin to sprout because all of the things that they need of light and humidity and moisture and so on and so forth actually exist. But there might be some things where the heat is still too large for, and so you would have to go into different environments. Okay. And if you cast those same seeds in a completely icy environment, they're not all going to sprout. So casting your intention is not any different, really, than sowing seeds. And in that way, you have to come to realize a deeper meaning of you reap what you sow. You also reap where you sow and how you sow. Okay. These are basic principles that are very important. But my point again is not necessarily to teach all of the dynamics of effective magic in a single discourse, but rather to expand upon the concept that interaction with what I now refer to as intrinsic data fields has always happened through myriad ways, whether that be through, again, magical practices or intention setting or prayer or, visualization and mentalist practices, psychic practices. All of these things are ways of interacting with various densities within the human multidimensional capacity to influence outcomes. And those who are able to understand better the dynamics of the various dimensions that they are casting their intentions into are going to have a much greater success than those who just do it willy-nilly, just in the same way that a gardener who plants very particular seeds that are suited for their area at the right time with the right conditions are going to see great fruition, whereas those who do otherwise are not going to see nearly as good a fruition, if any fruition at all. And that is the basic principle behind it. The world is very macrocosmic and microcosmic, and in that way we can actually say that the entire world is both holographic and fractal. And that seems to be one of the major quantum components that many scientists are starting to understand, which has already been known for thousands of years and is perfectly and succinctly stated in the Hermetic axioms, specifically of the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus. So with that being said, IDFs have already existed for many, many hundreds, if not thousands and thousands and thousands of years. In fact, in my opinion, based on what I have studied, I think that intrinsic data fields have been and will always be the primary way of human beings being able to affect and understand their environment through ritual. And again, a ritual is any action that is done with intention in order to achieve a desired result. And so that doesn't matter whether that's something physiological, like you're at the gym and you have the intention to grow muscle, and therefore you pick up weights and you perform repetitions of certain muscular sets. The likelihood and the variables that go into that are that the more that you stress the muscles out and cause muscular tear, the more that your muscles grow. And so you're putting yourself in the flow of events in order to make that happen. That's a very physiological example. But you can do and apply that very same thing to multiple different levels of consciousness. And that is where, say the laws of attraction and, abundance magic and, all of these other principles really have their root and where they really play. So again, with intrinsic data fields, that's kind of where they've happened. Now, where I'm starting to play with intrinsic data fields using what we would refer to as psychotronic or psionic or radionics technologies is really just a natural evolution of the way that people would inherently come to work with these things. And the reason is that it gets more and more and more and more and more dialed in the more time goes on that people are passing on these traditions. And the more technologically driven something can be, typically the more standardized it has to be, because it therefore has to be, it therefore has to be programmable. Okay. And things that are programmable have to have some set of standards behind them. And so as we have continued with our computer technology from, as far ancient back as the Antikythera mechanism and clock and timing instruments and devices, all the way up through the development of what we would consider to be the modern computer and computation and computational programming and so on and so forth. We're starting to see that the same types of technology that would develop along those same lines are going to also be utilized in ways that influence intrinsic data fields. And in fact, if you don't believe me, I want you to just simply take a look at the internet today. The internet gives you the astral right at your fingertips. When people ask me what the astral is, I say it's a repository of all the thoughts that have ever been thought and all the emotions that have ever been felt. And I like to usually, when people say, well, what is the astral? I think that it's best answered by asking another question. What happens to all of the thoughts that have been thought when they're done being thought, or all of the emotions that are that exist after they've been felt? Well, welcome to the astral. Okay, so the astral is a repository of all of those things. Now, with the internet, it is a perfect microcosmic way of interacting with that astral plane. And so for me, the internet is just another way of making accessible more subtle aspects of our multidimensional reality by way of images. Okay, by you can't touch the image doesn't exist in something that you can touch. You can print it and the image exists. If you're printing it on paper, it exists in 2D. If you're using now a 3D printer, which is even a newer piece of digital technology, then now you can interact with it in 3 dimensions. Do you see what I'm saying? Is that the image itself is something that cannot be grasped, but then it can be brought into the physical. And the same thing is true with ideas. Ideas they are very non-material, but then people can enact ideas. They can embody ideas. They can do things with their body that make the ideas somehow manifest in the physical realm. And that is, in a certain way, a type of magic all of its own. But it's more or less just manifesting, for lack of a better term, more subtle frequencies into physical frequencies. And by any other term, we can take the term frequency and replace it with IDF. Okay, it's a field of energy, it's a field of consciousness, it's a field of awareness. And so that idea has its own IDF, and that IDF can then descend from one dimension into a more dense dimension in order to make itself more well known. So, what we see with computerized technology is this very cool and interesting progression of experience. Now, for those of you who've already listened to our episode with Dr. Don Paris, he kind of goes through a little bit, he goes through it very fast, but he goes through a little bit of the history of radionics technologies. And realistically, this starts with Dr. Albert Abrams in 1863 through 1924. Well, he was born in 1863 and died in 1924. But he was the president of the San Francisco Medical Surgical Society, and he was also part of the faculty at Stanford University in California. And he had come up with this method of thumping and then eventually created an oscillator of resistance that would be able to create a stick by rubbing a glass rod over the stomach or the abdominal area. And the stick would happen. What I mean by stick is that just like the stick pad that we talked about earlier, this type of frictional effect that causes the thing to stop moving or stop rubbing, it would stick over the area where there would be a dull tone that he would use this thumping effect on. And so he ultimately ended up kind of being the grandfather, so to speak, of the modern radionics technology, because after that, we have a good number of different radionics methods that ultimately get developed. We also see Ruth Drown, and we see Thomas Galen Hieronymus, and we see Royal Rife, and we see so many different types of individuals start to use, even Wilhelm Reich, beginning to use technologies that are interacting with various different layers of the human multidimensional experience, and even what we could call the macrocosmic terrestrial experience, and being able to influence that through frequencies, and through instrumentation. And eventually, we see, people like Delaware, who were able to create some really amazing thing. There were many different radionic enthusiasts here, like Leo Court and Dr. Stevens, and a wide number of different people that were into this. And eventually, it comes down to us today through folks like Don Paris, where we just keep advancing that different technology and then utilizing various different radionics, psionics, psychotronic instrumentation to be able to influence what we can refer to as intrinsic data fields. And again, today, things like the Spooky 2 or the SE5 2000 or whatever, they can be called intrinsic data field analyzers, or they can be referred to as quantum scalar technology. They can be referred to by so many, energetic biofeedback, proximal energetic biofeedback. We can refer to it by multitudinous different names. There's no absolute standard on any of these things. Today, there are multitudes and myriad ways of expression of being able to do exactly the same thing, just under a different name. And largely that's driven by marketing and creating, niches and the demographic that you're reaching out to and things like that. That's what drives these different names. But it's the exact same core technology. And realistically, there are analog ways of influencing intrinsic data fields. And then there are more what we would refer to today as digital ways of being able to do that. And things like the instrument that I use, the SE5 2000, are basically able to influence these different fields by sending intentions that have definitive, qualitative, and quantitative numerical value plus written intention that are able to influence various layers of the intrinsic data field. And by influencing these things, we are able to essentially create a sort of balancing effect, a sort of balancing effect in those different fields, so that the fields then precipitate down from the spiritual to the causal, through the astral, down through the etheric interface, and into the physical or physiological dimension in such a way that we're able to see tangible results. This has been my work for 3 years, using this technology for wellness studies. And this has also been my basic technique as well for being able to assess the various energetic layers of things that we can see and interact with in spagyria. Like, for instance, I can see that there are chemical changes going on within a substance. I may not understand what is going on. And with modern chemical technology, it would also be very difficult while the process is happening to actually see what is going on in many of those instances. So I can read into the intrinsic data field of, say, the carbon or the hydrogen or the whatever, and I can begin to create successive measurements to be able to see if there are any changes in these atomic components that help give me some understanding of what is happening by way of the changes, and then refer back to chemistry that we already understand to see what it is that's actually happening in modern chemical language that makes these spagyric and alchemical processes from the past so important. But even beyond that, I can begin to see, what is the correlation between, say, this finished product that I have and a particular planet or a particular constellation. I can begin to see information about it, like, let's take this plant, and if I were to extract this with water to make an infusion, how many milliliters of water per grams of biomass should I ideally use in order to create an ideal infusion? What heat should I do that at, in terms of Celsius or Fahrenheit gradients? How long should I maintain it at particular temperatures, and so on and so forth? Because everything is already encrypted with ideal information about the thing. It exists within the very nature of the thing itself. Everything is encrypted with so much information. You are encrypted like a fingerprint in your energetic field, which we call an intrinsic data field, with every amount of information that you could possibly imagine pertaining and relative to your existence. It doesn't matter whether it's something that is happening or will happen or is likely to happen, or whether it has happened. Realistically, if we programmed in, we're limited somewhat by the types of programming that we have with our current instrumentation, but that is where the evolution of the instrumentation and with the programming will ultimately open this up in future years. Is if I had a list of all of these potential things that you ate last week for dinner on a Tuesday, I would be able to find out not only the time that you ate, but I'd also be able to find out, if I were choosing from, say, 50 or 100 different items, I'd be able to find out very statistically what it was that you most likely ate based on taking an amplitude reading of all of those different options and finding out which is the most true. And we can find that out through numerical calibration using dials and a stick pad in the very same way that we were able to find the frequencies that each of those food items correspond to in terms of their radionic rate. And we begin to dial things in that way through the science of what we would refer to today as intrinsic data field technology. And it's just a continuation of all of these ancient methods of interacting with IDFs that we've already seen in the past. So let's go ahead and take a break. We'll come back and we'll wrap this up. In today's age of rampant toxicity, it's important to have effective products at your disposal to maintain balance and well-being. One of the best products I've come across in over 15 years of actively looking for the best of the best for myself and my family is Zach Bush's Ion Biome products. Ion Gut Health in particular supports the body's production of beneficial enzymes through cellular communication. These enzymes help support the seals between the cells in your gut lining, thereby giving you a first-line defense against invading toxins, like the infamous glyphosate that's so notorious for completely destroying gut microbiome health. The most recent scientific studies suggest that somewhere around 70% of the human immune system is built in the gut and the gut lining, and this barrier is critical for your total well-being. So if you're anything like me and you care about the total health of you and your family, then do yourself a favor and order some Ion Gut Health today. Visit phoenixaurelius.org, scroll to the media tab, and select the Alchemi-culture podcast page. From there, you'll see a link for Ion Biome's Ion Gut Health. And as with all the links on our podcast page, this company offers us a small percentage of sales to help support our research and make this podcast a possibility. Welcome back from the break. Before we took the break, we were talking about myriad different ways of impacting and interacting with what we now refer to as IDFs, and how modern digital technology is able to interact with it. There are myriad ways, as I mentioned briefly, about analog ways to interact with it through intentions, through prayers, through intention setting, through magical practices. There's so many different ways of interacting with intrinsic data fields, and people are doing it all the time through intuition, through psychic degrees, through divination, through literally it just goes on and on and on and on and on. There is not a single person that has not interacted with intrinsic data fields. Every time you have a hunch about something, you're picking up on an intrinsic data field. Every time you have some sort of premonition about something, you're interacting with an intrinsic data field. Every time you eat something, you are interacting with intrinsic data fields. And it is simply a name that is given to help standardize the idea of what it is that we're interacting with. Because when we just talk about energy, that is a very nondescript thing. And what layer of energy are we talking about? Okay. When we talk about an intrinsic data field, we're talking about a field of energetic emanations that correspond to and compose the entirety of a thing on a quantum, holographic, and fractal perspective. And that's really all that an IDF is. And so when we're using IDF analysis, all we're doing is being able to take certain components of the entire macro IDF field and or micro IDF field of a material and be able to find out what is going on with it and be able to calibrate it with some sort of standardized numerical expression. Typically, we do this on a scale from 0 to 100, and we have both positive and negative tunings. Negative tunings go from 0 to 100 with anything above a 15, indicating as a standard that that thing is out of balance. And the closer to 100 it is, it means that it's really out of balance. The closer to 0 that it is means that it's not very out of balance at all. And when we see that there are positive tunings, the scale is also from 0 to 100, with anything below an 85 indicating that it's out of balance, with items near a 0 meaning really out of balance, and items near 100 saying it's very in balance. So it's a very standardized numerical calibration system that is basically running on a B plus average system. What I mean about that is that 85 out of 100 is a B plus. If something is operating with a B plus average or higher, then it's, typically got a pretty firm handle on the information and it's at a good passing grade. If it's below an 85% in its function or form or structure or whatever the case is, then it's not working so very well. But then we also see various things like vitality that can be on scales of 0 to infinitude, to be perfectly honest. And the limitation of the hardware of the SE5 2000 and of other instruments to go up to say, I think we can operate up to 10,000. And realistically, I can operate in magnitudes of 10 from there as high as I want. So it's not terribly limited. I just have to change the way that I phrase the question or phrase the intention of what it is that I'm putting out there and change the radionic rate accordingly. But realistically, all I have to do is be able to find out what the amplitude of something is reading at within that intrinsic data field, utilizing a technology that is partially kinesiological. And what I mean by that is that we're using a stick pad in order to find that calibrated rate, and also a dial. And that dial can move as slow or as fast as the operator wants to. So, in a certain regard, there's quite a great room for error and deviation within the modern realm of using these instruments, just like there is with any instrument. If I pick up a drum set, I'm able to play at a certain tempo and in a certain time signature, but I can take that time signature and tempo and I can entirely change it from 4/4 timing at 65 beats, per minute or something. I can take that up to 125 beats per minute and play in a 3/8 timing, for instance. Okay. So that's going to drastically change the sound and the timbre, and to some degree that's going to alter the entire nature of the song. So there are variances with this instrument from player to player, so to speak, or operator to operator, or analyst to analyst, however you want to be able to refer to somebody who interfaces with this type of standardized digital IDF technology. But this is why, as a whole, I am trying to put together important, peer reviewed scientific ways of reducing those variables as much as possible and being able to get calibrated readings from person to person. And over here at the Research Academy, I'm working with Noriano one-on-one in order to be able to help standardize not only the technology that we're using, but also the methodology that we're using, how fast we're operating the dials, how fast and in what direction we are using the stick pads, or in our case, a precision stick detector, and being able to standardize as much as we possibly can to rule out the variables that could create subjective differences between operator to operator. And we also are taking readings to help to eliminate various things like other energetic interference, like electromagnetism, wireless radiation, radio frequencies, any form of radiation realistically. Also, persuasions that an operator might have biases that an operator might have, etc., and performing as much psychic and energy and mental and emotional training as possible to be able to eliminate those as variables so that we can get as much as we can into a control state to understand from a scientific perspective what type of scientific merit is there not only to this technology, but how can this standardized technology with this equipment and this methodology be utilized, say, for the benefit of human wellness or agricultural purposes or ecological purposes and wellness, or even for, as I'm doing it right now, spagyric and alchemical, which transcends also into chemical analytics and so on and so forth, because I have found that there is a complete correspondence to these types of things. And everything that I do these days, based on formulation in the laboratory, to formulation for my clients, to even just questions of would it be in my highest and best good to go to the hot springs this evening or anything, really gets filtered through this technology. If I have any sort of doubt whatsoever or already don't understand a process fully, I'm able to use it for those types of purposes. And in so doing, I find that I have a much more enriched, much more beneficial, much more cohesive experience, and one that helps to eliminate doubt. Now, various colleagues of mine, such as Dr. Kaufman, have mentioned in the past that he thinks that essentially all that I'm doing is tapping into what he feels is the placebo experience, which is not a bad thing. He even makes mention of that, is that he thinks that placebo is an awesome way to heal. And if you can manufacture that placebo, then you're really hitting the sweet spot in terms of helping people to heal themselves. But I have so much data where I can show that that is a complete misunderstanding of the technology and shows a complete lack of experience with it as well, because the tomatoes in my yard are not able to be impacted by placebo. The animals that I have worked on are not able to be impacted by placebo. They don't know that anybody is even working on them from an IDF perspective. The soil microbes, okay, all of the different types of microbes that we've worked on in the laboratory here using IDF technology, they could really care less about placebo. And as far as we know, don't interact with it in any way, shape, or form. So unless we open up what the concept of placebo is vastly beyond its current understanding, the way that it's talked about from a medical perspective, there's absolutely no chance that what we are doing is impacting placebo and therefore impacting other people's wellness or the wellness of plants and animals and microbes and all of these other things. And there's absolutely no way that the plants that I have can placebo by some effect these precise divinatory methods where they tell me exactly how many grams to use per how many milliliters of ethanol or water or whatever, exactly which extraction methods to use in order to produce the most potent, most standardized, most amazing type extracts that we possibly can. There's just no way. That's not the way that it works. It's completely. I don't like to use the term impossible very frequently, but this would be one of those cases where it technically would be an impossibility that that's what's happening in terms of placebo. What we are seeing is a valid and verifiable way of exchanging information through unseen realms by interacting with what we would refer to as intrinsic data fields. And I have seen it over and over. Those of you who have watched the interview that we had with Dr. Don Paris, he's seen it over and over. There are thousands of us across the planet who are using radionics and biofeedback and other energetic technologies like this, where we are impacting intrinsic data fields. Those of you who are energy healers in any way, shape, or form, you have seen it where you have been able to impact the quote unquote energy, which I would just say, replace the term energy with IDF. You are interacting with the IDFs of the clients that you're working with. And you have seen these things. Okay, it's undeniable once you have experienced it. The people that tend to be skeptical about this in a negative way, because I'm also very skeptical. I've always been skeptical of everything. And if this wasn't proven to me by actually having Noriana worked on and her having overcome issues that were very mysterious, I never would have believed that this was even possible at all. It's just, from my very scientific upbringing and way of looking at things, I felt that this was complete crockery and that there was no way that you could take a photograph or even an imprint of something and read all of its energy. I mean, that's so Star Trekky in a certain way that it was beyond my capacity of understanding. But I had already seen and heard about it. And again, for those of you who are not aware or totally sold on the concepts of multidimensional awareness or multidimensional existence, all you need to do is pick up some books, read about these things, and then see, test in your own environment if you can interact with these various levels. And if so, and you can't actually diagnose or cut into them in order to be able to find them, then you have to, you have to admit that these various subtle energies, for lack of a better term, completely exist and that you can interact with them. And by any other term, that is by definition multidimensional. There are various dimensions that can be interacted with and experienced. And I strongly suggest everybody, I mean, it's a thick and chewy read, but if you have not read Dr. Richard Gerber's Vibrational Medicine, you really don't know even what you're talking about in terms of multidimensional wellness. You lack the entire foundational structural understanding from a scientific perspective to understand how all matter is really composed of energy in a very concrete and very down to earth and understandable way that can be repetitively shown and demonstrated time and time again. And this is just as true for the energy healers who are already making energetic advancements with their clients as it is from complete skeptics who are, extremely terrestrial in their thoughts and don't believe in any form of energy at all. It's equally as relevant to each of those communities, and they're probably both going to find the material to be just as difficult to go through because it's very chewy and it's going to expand everything. Those who are very kind of airy fairy and feely and experiential type of people will find that they have to use that left side of their analytical brain in order to understand the information. And those who come from the left analytical brain are going to have to reach out into the right brain and into the feeling and experiential kind of realms in order to be able to understand and fully implement the ideas that are proposed inside of there, and to be able to view things from very unbiased and very scientific way. And that book is full of scientific experiments, most of which had taken place under the tutelage of many different PhDs and doctors, physicists, etc., and lots of them at McGill University. And I mean, we're talking about actual credited universities that, are producing scientists and otherwise that know exactly what they're talking about, how they're doing it, following scientific method rigorously, and so on and so forth. And in there, you will find that there are entire chapters. And in fact, I think there is an entire chapter, let me phrase that properly, about radionics equipment. And you will see how Dr. Richard Gerber's opinion of it is actually very high and very well praised. But he goes from everything from crystal healing and homeopathy and Bach flower essences and psychic healings and hands-on healings and all these other things, and showing under no uncertain circumstances how they actually work. And every single one of those methods of what he refers to as vibrational medicine are, by any other name, ways of interacting with various layers of the intrinsic data field in order to create influences that can then be measured, and they are quantifiable, they are quantitative, and they are also qualitative. And so I think people need to really read that and understand that as a primer. There are also thousands of books out there. If you just do an Amazon search for various radionics books, you will come across dozens of them where you can understand the technology and the history and the advancement and all these other things so much more. And once you start to do that and hopefully bridge what I have given here in this talk with the information that you will encounter, you will begin to see that intrinsic data fields are, at present, the best chance for us as human beings to advance in so many different ways, but particularly in the fields of wellness, in the fields of chemistry, in the fields of physics, in the fields of everything, because we can interact with this unseen field of energy, all of the unseen fields of energy, and be able to inquire more about them, to understand if we're even on the right track, to understand what proper terminology should be, and so on and so forth. And it can literally lead us into an entirely new paradigm for humanity. And for my part, that is a grand part of my intention with utilizing this technology, is to be able to standardize it in such a way that I can provide myriad applications, so that hundreds of years from now, people can look back at the standardization that happened and realize that it was just a focal point for all of the amazing progress and discoveries that could possibly exist within the human multidimensional experience and within our experience here as Earth-based beings, for the benefit of all modes of life and of all forms of existence. So, anyway, I've been on my soapbox for long enough this evening. I hope that gives you something to chew on for a little bit. I'd love it if you guys have questions, especially if there are enough questions. I can take those questions and turn them into another podcast episode where I'm actually able to discuss these types of things and address these types of things from my perspective. Again, I don't have all of the answers. I'm far from the finish line and having all the answers. I just have a technology and a way of interacting with things where I'm able to find out as best as I possibly can from the frameworks that I have at present and the words and whatever other limitations that I have, to be able to try and address these types of questions. So, in some ways, people might refer to that as an unfair advantage, but I think it's a perfectly fair advantage and a wonderful way of trying to access new ideas. Again, because I don't use beliefs. I think the beliefs are the enemy of mankind. That's a uh, podcast topic all of its own, I suppose. But I'm not interested in a belief, because either something can be demonstrated or it can't. If it can be demonstrated, then I don't need to believe in it. Belief is obsolete. And if I can't demonstrate it, then all I need to have is an idea. I don't need to have any sort of sense of emotional or mental security around that idea that locks it into a belief, because that is indeed false and does not hold a candle and actually creates a lot of friction against other people who have conflicting beliefs. It's much easier to have ideas that are malleable and presentable and changeable within the face of better information. And that's kind of where I keep myself entirely open, using the framework I have now as a jumping point to move forward. And yeah, that's that. So if you have questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. I'd love to explore more. I'd love to talk about this topic more. I'd love to get more people interested in this work. So let us know what's up. And as always, thank you so much for listening. If you like this podcast, be sure to thumbs up, subscribe, hit the bell notification if you're watching on YouTube. And, if you want to continue to support my work and podcasts and information like this, can consider purchasing some Spagurics or signing up for our Spagurics of the Month Club, which is the best way of supporting our work. And that gives you enormous discounts month over month on the 5 new releases in our apothecary each month, and helps us to generate consistent income, so that we don't have to think about creating new projects and all these other things. We can focus on the things that we inherently do in the first place, that help to bring all of this magic and information to you and make it accessible. So, as always, thank you guys so much. This is an Alchemi-culture podcast. I'm your host, Phoenix Aurelius, signing off, and thank you so much. We'll talk to you here soon.